Hello everybody, welcome to What Culture. I'm Scott, joined by Josh.
Hello, Scott.
Josh, my friend. Now, usually we're over on What Culture Gaming doing weekly reviews of The Last of Us HBO TV show, which we would obviously recommend. They go up every Tuesday with a whole bunch of breakdowns on ups and downs and the things that the episodes do well and whatever every single week. But in amongst putting those together, Mr. Josh Brown picked up on a bunch of different things that are pointing to what The Last of Us Season 2 will be, which very much ties into The Last of Us Part 2, the video game.
Yes.
Now, we're going to break all these things down, but full spoilers, at least provisionally, for the way that Last of Us Part 1 and 2, the games went. Because so far there are obviously deviations in the HBO show, so things might be different as things roll out, but we're going to point out the things
100%, because the most interesting thing, in my opinion, from episode 6, Scott Telford, was how it spent a good portion of the episode's screen time setting things up that won't happen until season 2 at the very latest, because there are so many plot points from The Last of Us Part 2 that were seeded in this episode and hinted at and foreshadowed that it kind of blew my mind. I didn't expect them to link it so closely like they have, because they don't really do that in part 1. These references, for the most part, aren't present in the original game. So like Scott said, we're going to fully spoil potential future plot lines here, so if you haven't played the game and if you care about where this story is going, then I'm so sorry, we're about to get into it. But
I feel like what the beauty of it though is that we don't know. I feel like, Craig Mazin getting out there and saying, even if you know the video game's like the back of your hand, there are still surprises to come. So I'm kind of hanging a lot of stuff on that, of like things could go in various directions, and we'll just see. These are the things that we can point to that correlate with the video game, but that might not be the way that it goes.
Most of these take place in Jackson, Scott Telford, which again, you don't actually see in the original Last of Us game. That is a construction that is talked about and you see from afar, but you don't enter the streets of Jackson until the opening moments of The Last of Us Part 2. So that in itself is kind of a reference to the second game, because all of the streets, all of the kind of main locations, like the big dance hall, are viewed this early on, and they don't turn up until later on in the game itself, in the game series. But the first character, I guess you could refer to them as that we see from part 2 is actually the horse Shimmer. We get to see Ellie's horse from part 2. Ellie actually meets Shimmer the horse from part 2 in this episode. And of course, while we might not see Shimmer yet again in this season, we absolutely will see Shimmer, presumably, going forward. I just thought that was a neat little way to kind of like seed that connection earlier on, because without going into graphic detail, Shimmer doesn't necessarily get a good end in part 2. Nothing good happens to anyone in the world of The Last of Us, but Shimmer perhaps gets an untimely demise, some would say. And I thought most of these details, like introducing Shimmer so early in some of the stuff we're going to talk about, ultimately is going to break our hearts in a few years' time.
All over and over and over again. I do find it fascinating that you have a creative team that obviously put the games together. One of the lead writers, Neil Druckmann, going over and being part of the TV series, and then now having the knowledge of both video game parts. How do you then restructure that initial first installment so it flows even more naturally into part 2? I think things like this are really, really cool. And there was also, we talked about this before recording, that they had the idea of fleshing out Jackson as a place back in the original game, but they just didn't have enough time for that. So it is quite cool seeing that, Last of Us Part 2's timeline Jackson now in the original game.
Absolutely, man. And speaking of other people from Jackson, we got our first look potentially at Dina. Obviously, Ellie's love interest in part 2, who was introduced in that game. It's not been officially confirmed that this is the same character, but things seem to add up. In The Last of Us Part 2, Ellie and Dina have a conversation about the first time they actually met, which happened off screen, but it's described as Dina seeing Ellie, who was the new girl in Jackson at the time, wolfing down her dinner like there was going to be no more food that she'll ever have. And in this scene in the show, it's Ellie having the first meal, presumably that she's, as she describes,
she's ever had
in her life, really enjoying it, wolfing it down. She spots this girl from across the room. She tells her essentially to scram. So a lot of people are assuming that is going to be Dina, which is fascinating, because this is the first time that I'm aware of that they have, referenced a character from part 2 directly, and not only referenced them, but shown them potentially on screen, which is really interesting, and not a remix that I was personally expecting from the show.
No, I think it's cool. I think, like I said, I like the whole reframing of the whole idea, the amount of different elements that you can plug into part 1 so that part 2 sort of just immediately comes out of it. We don't know where the games are going. We don't know if they are going to, assuming they'll do a part 3, and it's always been talked about, various different things pointing towards that, but the assumption of it always being a trilogy, it's like, well, these were the things that were always essential from the beginning, and I like the idea of kind of borrowing from the time period in between both installments when Ellie was in Jackson and those things were happening, foreshadowing, and just sort of just little seeds.
Yeah,
put
100%.
the seeds in there.
I just think it's a really good way to flesh out things that were talked about in either Game 1 or Game 2 and show them. We got that, and this isn't a reference to Part 2, but we got that with Ellie's interaction with Maria here. In the game, Maria gives Ellie the photo of Joel and Sarah, and that happens off screen. Here we actually see the interaction of Maria telling Ellie about Sarah and what happened to Joel and filling in Joel's backstory and conveying that to Ellie here. Just little things like that are mentioned that get full scenes in the adaptation are really appreciated. I want to talk about Tommy next.
Do it.
Tommy, Gabriel Luna's Tommy is absolutely outrageously good. I every time this guy's on screen, I'm like, you're the coolest guy.
He is.
Maybe in the entire world. But
Tommy's just a cool character.
he is.
Cool
He
dude.
really is.
I like him.
And unfortunately, again, for most of the characters in Part 2, his hardenedness, for lack of a better phrase, is foreshadowed here. We get him talking to Ellie and Joel about how proficient he's become as a sniper, how he can apparently shoot the undead from, what was it, half a mile away?
Something like that, some insane amount. And Joel obviously calls BS on it.
Absolutely, but obviously this foreshadows his role in Part 2, where he is literally a sniper enemy. At one point, he's hunting down Abby and her team by, sniping them off. He even gets a few kills in and of himself. And he also, during the scene where he's talking about becoming a good sniper, talks to Ellie, and Ellie says, "Can you teach me?" Again, this foreshadows a scene that happens in Part 2 where he actually does give Ellie the rifle and he's given her, instructions on how to shoot the infected from miles away. I just thought that was, again, another neat thing to seed here that will presumably be paid off in the flashback episode to come.
I, for one, I'm a massive fan of Ellie-Tommy chemistry. I'm a big fan of pairing those characters together. I like that that's the way things went in the most recent episode. I just give me that.
It's really good.
Give me all those little bits in between Part 1 and Part 2 when Ellie and Tommy are just hanging out. Give me that.
I can't go on to the next thing without issuing another spoiler warning. I know we've done it already, but I've kept vague. Now I just can't keep vague. I'm going to talk about who lives and who dies in the game. So if you don't want to know that, please, again, this is your final warning.
And again, only the game timeline.
Only the game timeline, of course. We have no idea if this is going to happen in the show, but potentially, you know what I mean? I want to talk about Joel's house, Scott Tilford.
Okay.
This was the thing that got me the most from episode 6. We see Joel's house that he eventually inherits in The Last of Us Part 2 in this episode. He's only staying for the night right now, but they make a change from the original game in regards to the scene where you have that confrontation between Ellie and Joel, and he says, I'm not your dad. She says, I'm not her, That really charged scene now takes place within what is going to become Joel's house in one of the bedrooms. And I just thought that, for me personally, is so poignant because you know what's going to happen to Joel in the next game. And if it happens in the show, they're already seeding this house as a kind of place where memories were made, where their relationship was defined. You get that moment in The Last of Us Part 2, the game, after Joel is gone, where you explore the house and you're picking up artifacts from the first game, you're picking up photographs, you're picking up, his favorite coffee cup. And I love the idea that they're going to wreck us in Season 2 or Season 3, where you have Ellie, search this house again, look at the room where they had this confrontation that was such a pivotal part of their experience. That, to me, is just great.
I think that's
foreshadowing.
That's a really interesting reframing, because obviously in the game it takes place in like a lodge that they find in the middle of the woods, and that's how Ellie's able to find the diary that has all the entries about what it was like living as a girl back in the 2000s or whenever it was, and sort of reframing that and making it that it's almost a parallel of Sarah's room, in terms of like all the different band posters and all that kind of stuff and teenage stuff that's in there. Just lots of little thematic rhyming elements, little couplets and stuff that are in there, that if you're a fan of foreshadowing and things paying off, it very much knits together very well.
That's the exact word I used in the Ups and Downs, Scott Taylor, rhyming. Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann seem to be a big fan of rhyming, not only stuff that's already happened previously in the season, but what's going to happen, presumably, if they stick to the main course of the game. Speaking of, we have that excellent conversation before they get to Jackson and after they leave Jackson about what they want to do, that being Joel and Ellie, should a vaccine be made. Like, how would they want to live their lives? What is their kind of like dream role in society? What is their dream job? What are they passionate about? And Ellie, of course, says that she wants to go to the moon. She's interested in space. This has been established in the show already. She wants to go to the moon. But importantly, Joel originally says that he wants to get a nice bit of land, get a nice farmhouse, and essentially bring up a load of old sheep, which tragically is what Ellie does in The Last of Us Part 2. After Joel has died, after she has temporarily given up on her revenge mission, she does go to a big farmhouse. She does start herding these sheep. And I just thought, if they do pay that off in the show, if that is something Ellie tries to do to honor Joel's memory, I'm gone. I'm crying all over again.
I still think that's. I love the idea of like I said, you're Neil Druckmann. You've made both of these games. You're fully aware of all the different things that you put into those projects across all those years. You have all those like tapestries of those games just laid out on as some sort of ethereal canvas. And okay, we're going to pick this. We're going to put this over here. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And just weaving things together into an altogether like different but still tightly related package. I think that is even just a nice payoff, even if you know the way the game goes. It still feels good knowing that they put that in there. So I think that works very, very well too.
I think it's really interesting because obviously as someone who has played the games like you and I have, and presumably you have if you're watching this, you're picking up on this stuff early. But if you haven't played the games, you're getting a lot of plot points seeded right now that are going to pay off in maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, maybe longer, depending on how long production takes and whether or not they do adapt these specific beats in the future. And I just think that's quite confident writing if that is the route they're going to go down. I said this in the review, but it's almost like they're writing the show not just sort of season by season, but they're thinking about it as a complete package where, they're maybe quote-unquote sacrificing time right now to set something off that might not be paid off for years at a time, but when we view the show as a whole, hopefully we'll look back, episode 6 of season 1 and think this thing that happened in season 3, episode 2 was seeded here. Have it be more impactful in that way. Perhaps.
There's also the potential of, like I said, we don't know what the hell part 3 is or how far along that is as a general sketch idea or whatever. There's also the idea that we don't even realize the things that they're planning here could pay off in a part 3 and then eventually it all comes full circle anyway. But considering how tightly knit and how well considered everything is so far, it just feels like they know exactly what they're doing. It does feel like a confident rollout of a series of plot elements and thematic elements as well.
It does, and you know what? Some people might not necessarily like it. I'm not saying these are all inherent good things, but it's just a kind of a fascinating way to approach an adaptation because they've taken time out of an episode that could have been more faithful to the game. It could have taken place at the dam where you originally do meet Tommy and Maria in the game, and they could have kind of excised this and still have it be impactful by including these elements in season 2. But the fact that they're thinking so far ahead, even though they didn't have a season 2 order at the time, it just kind of fills me with a little bit of confidence.
I tell you, I wonder as well if you seed the sort of shift or whatever you want to call Last of Us Part 2. It's a lot darker of a game, even though there are lots of aspects of light in there. A lot of people's problem with Part 2 was that it was just so macabre, it was just so dark, etc. If you seed all those elements and you let people look forward to them, and then you have this idea that going, as the show rolls out, the Part 1 and Part 2 are almost rolling out together kind of thing. And whether that does make people reappreciate Part 2, obviously it's still sold incredibly well. But I just wonder if that does get people playing Part 2 again. And maybe reappreciating it.
Maybe. I think cool. I think it's quite an interesting way to approach it because obviously in a video game you have a lot of time, a lot of downtime where it's just you and the character. How many hours do you spend in The Last of Us Part 1 just with Ellie, just exploring, just getting to know each other, having that incidental dialogue that you don't have the time for in a show? You get 9 episodes and that's it. You don't have 15 hours worth of moseying, for lack of a better term. And I think this might benefit the story of Part 2 because it might not seem as jarring. If we have this stuff established now, then you can get straight into The Last of Us Season 2 with Jackson already established, with Dina already teased, we already know about Shimmer, we've already got Tommy's potential role in that season foreshadowed, and like you said, maybe that makes the transition into Part 2's story in Season 2 that a little bit easier to stomach, perhaps.
Yeah, I would say so. Like I said, I like the confidence that's coming out here, and I just like the idea of a creator being able to go back to an original work that is now 10 years old and just thinking, okay, what would I tweak? What would I change? How would I prepare the audience for certain aspects that are coming up? And wanting to see someone like Dina this early is very, very worthwhile.
I've got one more thing to say. You were talking about The Last of Us Part 2 being dark, right? It is, especially what happens to all of the main characters. But Tommy in particular goes down such a dark path, obsessed with revenge to the point where he pushes his wife away. He gets shot in the head and manages to survive, but he's a shell of his former self by the end of the game. Interestingly, in this episode, they are giving him a kid.
I was just going to say
that Maria is pregnant, which ultimately gives them even more to potentially lose in a season 2 or a season 3. And it makes me interested in how they're going to adapt his arc, because it's one thing leaving Jackson and leaving his wife behind, it's another thing entirely potentially abandoning his kid,
which is what Ellie does
as well. And it makes me just kind of think, is that going to make those character parallels even more straightforward and connected or not? How are they going to incorporate that into the story? Will it make it more tragic? Perhaps.
We'll have to see. One last thing as well is that it's mentioned in here that Joel, if he gets time, would want to become a singer.
Yes!
Which is a reference to the fact that in Last of Us Part 2, Joel Miller sings Pearl Jam's song, which name I'm forgetting. Future Days.
Future Days.
A lovely little song. That the thing is, in terms of the timeline of the game, that song was released. It was right about Outbreak Day in the game's timeline.
Yeah.
So Neil Druckmann's justification was that Joel went to that gig, saw the song for the first time ever, sight and sound learned it, and then banked it for 20 years, and then played it to Ellie. So whether they do the same song or not, I guess we'll see. The Johnny Cash song was in the other episode where they crashed the car and everything.
Yes.
So I guess we'll see how much those things carry over, but they're seeding that too, the idea that we'll get some sort of Pedro Pascal guitar moment at some point.
I'm going off kind of script for the topic of this video because you're absolutely right. Yeah, they are seeding that. And he did actually mention in the game that he will sing to Ellie, but in part 1, we never see that. But there is one of those kind of not deleted scenes, but there was a scene acted out by Neil Druckmann, by Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson that kind of showed Joel, singing to Ellie for the first time. Do they pay that off earlier than season 2, or do they wait to do the Pearl Jam Future Days in the opening of the next episode, or do we get a scene this season of Joel singing?
I don't know. It depends what they want to end the actual season on. I mean, one of my favorite cuts to black, one of my favorite editorial choices in anything ever is the cut to black at the end of The Last of Us 1.
Yeah.
Where you don't necessarily know just how much of Joel's lie Ellie believes. I always love that. So I kind of always wanted a show to have the cojones to end the same way. But at the same time, if you had Joel singing Future Days, if I was ever to lose you, I'd surely lose myself, they perfectly encapsulate their relationship. So it depends how much you want to go into that stuff. I don't know. I feel like this season's either going to end in fire and brimstone and all the Firefly stuff going up in flames, and then you go to the lie and everything else, or we end on a more somber note that's just sort of okay, where do we go from here, and just seeding that lie a bit more clearly, because if there's one thing that Mason's brought to the table, it is spelling things out a bit more to make sure that people can keep up with various thematics and questions.
I know we keep saying one more thing, right?
Go on.
But all of this part 2 seeding does make me now incredibly confident that we will get more of Abby and her dad in the last episode.
Oh my god, yeah.
Because we get out some flashbacks to that in part 2, but
do they cast Abby in season 1?
This is it, right? Do we actually see the person who's going to play Abby at the end of this season? I have no idea, but it makes me inclined to think that they will try to seed that a little bit more directly.
That's a very, very good shout. I mean, if you've played Last of Us Part 2, you know that there are various scenes that plug into the timeline of things that were going on at the end of Part 1, so you might as well seed that stuff, especially if you want to really show just how bad of a decision or how violent a decision Joel makes. You might as well flesh out the humanity of the Doctor who goes up against him. So there's a lot more to look forward to in regards to the way things are panning out. We have reference material, we have source material and potential things to predict with, but it seems like the HBO show is very much its own thing, very much an addition to the overall Last of Us canon. So let us know what you think down in the comments below. What are you looking forward to? What do you think will come in season 2? Will we get Abby by the end of season 1? And etc. etc. I've been Scott Taylor from WhatCulture.com.
I mean Josh from WhatCulture.com.
We'll catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. It's the main channel in here.
It is? Whoa. It looks like the gaming channel, doesn't it?